It started with a letter. Folded neatly and slipped beneath the front door, it carried the sharp, officious tone of authority that only the HOA could manage. The paper was crisp, the logo embossed, the message printed in bold. Violation notice, unauthorized construction on property. The homeowner, Mark, stared at it in disbelief. He hadn't built anything, no fences, no sheds, nothing that could possibly violate the community rules. The letter claimed he had erected a structure obstructing the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. It even threatened fines if he didn't remove it immediately. But the so-called structure was just a small wooden trellis, a modest frame for his climbing roses, tucked neatly beside the mailbox. It wasn't even visible from most angles. Mark had seen dozens of similar trellises across the neighborhood. The only difference was his proximity to her. Karen. She lived 3 houses down, the self-appointed neighborhood watch, the unofficial enforcer of rules she didn't actually write. She attended every HOA meeting, complained about lawn lengths, trash bins, and even mailboxes that didn't match the community shade of beige. Mark had been warned by other neighbors. Stay quiet, keep your head down, and don't give Karen a reason, they said. But he hadn't expected his garden to become her latest battleground. 2 days after the letter, a white SUV with the HOA logo appeared in front of his house. 2 men stepped out, uniformed but not police. They introduced themselves as community compliance officers. They said they were there to inspect the reported structure. Mark stood back and watched as they circled his yard, jotting notes, taking photos. One of them pointed at the trellis and nodded to the other. "Yep, that's the one," he said under his breath, loud enough for Mark to hear. It was surreal, like watching a parody of authority. They handed him a clipboard with a citation notice and a warning. Failure to remove the unauthorized structure could result in fines of up to $500 a week. Mark tried to explain that it was just a decorative garden piece, but they didn't care. They said they had a complaint from a resident and photo evidence. When Mark asked to see the evidence, they refused, saying it was confidential. That night, the cameras went up. Mark installed a small security system around his front yard, 2 visible cameras and 1 hidden. If the HOA wanted to play games, he'd have proof of everything. Days passed quietly. Then, one morning, he noticed something strange on the footage. A woman in a sun hat, carrying a clipboard, pacing back and forth in front of his property. She paused, snapped photos of his house, then crouched near the trellis, pretending to adjust her shoe while pointing her phone at the base of it. It was Karen. That same afternoon, another notice arrived, this time, labeled Final Warning. According to the HOA, Mark had ignored 2 previous communications, which never existed, and now owed $1,000 in fines. The letter ended with a threat: failure to comply may result in escalation to HOA enforcement. Mark wasn't sure what HOA enforcement meant. He assumed it meant another inspection or maybe a lien threat. But what showed up next was something else entirely. 3 days later, a black SUV rolled down the street. The doors opened, and out stepped the same community officers, this time wearing tactical-style vests with the words HOA Security Unit embroidered on them. They carried radios, flashlights, and clipboards. One of them even had a holstered taser. It looked ridiculous and intimidating. They approached the door and began knocking, loudly, repeatedly. Mark opened it, phone recording in hand. The taller officer announced they were executing a compliance order and demanded access to his property to verify removal. Mark calmly refused entry, citing his rights. The officer responded with a threat to contact law enforcement for obstruction. That was the moment Mark decided he'd had enough. He told them to go ahead and call the police. But they didn't. Instead, they took photos, issued another citation, and left. That night, Mark compiled all his footage. Karen sneaking around, the fake officers making demands, the bogus letters. He organized everything into a folder labeled HOA Harassment. The next morning, the situation escalated further. A certified letter arrived, stamped by the HOA board, claiming he was now in violation of multiple community rules and subject to a formal hearing. It included a line that made Mark's stomach turn: failure to appear may result in HOA enforcement actions, including property access. They were threatening to come onto his property. Mark decided to act first. He went to the police department with his evidence. The desk officer listened carefully, brows raised higher with every clip Mark showed. The officer confirmed that the HOA police had no actual legal authority. They were private security, not law enforcement. But the most shocking part came next. The officer pulled up the name of the community enforcement company the HOA had hired. It wasn't even licensed to operate in their state. Mark left the station with a copy of the report and an idea. The next day, he sent an email to the HOA board. It was polite, short, and clear. He would no longer be communicating with their security officers, and any further harassment would be forwarded directly to the police. He didn't expect what came next. That night, his cameras caught another scene. Karen, pacing again. But this time, she wasn't alone. The same fake officers were there, talking with her, pointing toward his house. One of them even stepped onto his lawn. Mark quietly uploaded the footage to a secure drive and made a few calls. The following morning, he woke up early. He brewed his coffee, checked the camera feed, and waited. By mid-morning, the HOA police SUV rolled up again. But this time, before they could even get out, a second car appeared behind them, this one black and white, with flashing blue lights. The real police. As the HOA officers froze in place, the patrol car door opened. A real officer stepped out, calm and confident, and walked up to the SUV. The HOA enforcers tried to talk, gesturing toward Mark's house. But the officer motioned for them to stop, asked for identification, and radioed something back to dispatch. Mark watched from his window as the situation unfolded. The HOA officers looked nervous now, less official, more exposed. The officer kept them there for several minutes before finally waving them off the property. As the fake police drove away, Karen's blinds snapped shut. Mark knew this wasn't the end. The HOA wouldn't back off that easily. But now he had the law and the truth on his side. He just didn't know that what came next would turn the neighborhood upside down. For the next few days, the neighborhood was quiet, unnaturally quiet. The white SUV with the HOA logo was gone. The security officers didn't patrol the street anymore. Even Karen, who usually spent her mornings inspecting everyone's yards under the pretense of walking her dog, seemed to have vanished. Mark thought, maybe for a moment, that it was over. But HOA grudges rarely die easily. 3 days after the real police incident, a thick envelope arrived in his mailbox. Inside was a printed notice with bold red lettering, HOA hearing notice, mandatory attendance required. It was an official summons from the Homeowners Association Board. They accused him of harassment of HOA staff, defamation of the HOA organization, and obstruction of community enforcement. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so serious. At the bottom, it warned that failure to attend could result in legal action or even foreclosure proceedings. They were escalating. Mark wasn't easily intimidated. He spent the evening gathering his evidence, every photo, video, and report neatly labeled. He reviewed the footage again, Karen meeting the fake officers, the security patrol stepping on his lawn, and the police confrontation. It was all there, undeniable proof that the HOA had overstepped every boundary imaginable. The hearing was set for Friday evening, in the community clubhouse, a small, overly air-conditioned room that smelled faintly of bleach and fake plants. When Mark arrived, 6 board members sat at a long folding table at the front. Karen, of course, sat among them. She had a neat stack of papers in front of her and a smug look that could curdle milk. They called the meeting to order and immediately launched into accusations. The security team, they said, had been hired to maintain order. Mark, they claimed, had verbally intimidated them and obstructed community enforcement. They even played a short clip, grainy phone footage of Mark standing in his yard, arms crossed, facing the so-called officers. The video conveniently started after they'd stepped onto his property and left out all the parts that mattered. Karen leaned forward, reading from a statement. She painted him as aggressive, disruptive, and uncooperative with community leadership. Every word dripped with self-importance. Mark listened in silence. When they finally asked for his response, he didn't speak. He just pulled out his laptop and connected it to the projector. And then he played his footage. First came the video of Karen sneaking around the trellis with her camera. Then, the body cam style clip of the fake officers issuing citations. The final video showed the Real police arriving, questioning the HOA security, and forcing them to leave. The room went silent. Karen's confident smile faltered. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably, glancing between her and the screen. Another cleared his throat and quietly asked to pause the video. But Mark let it play until the very end, where the officer's voice could be heard clearly saying, "These men aren't authorized to enforce anything." When the lights came back on, no one spoke for several seconds. Finally, the HOA president, an older man named Richard, tried to smooth things over. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, that the security company had been overzealous. But Mark didn't buy it. He told them about the unlicensed enforcement company and the police report he'd filed. The board members exchanged uneasy looks. Karen, meanwhile, was visibly fuming. Her face was flushed, her hands trembling as she shuffled her papers. Before leaving, Mark handed each of them a folder containing copies of the evidence and the police report. He didn't raise his voice or threaten anything. He simply said, "If this harassment continues, I'll let the city handle it." As he walked out of the room, Karen's glare followed him like a shadow. He thought that would end it. He was wrong. The very next morning, the harassment took a new form. Someone had plastered anonymous flyers across the neighborhood bulletin boards and mailboxes. They accused Mark of endangering the community, attacking HOA volunteers, and being hostile toward neighbors. It was all lies, but the damage was immediate. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Some whispered when he passed. Others stopped waving. Karen's gossip machine was working overtime. That evening, a city code enforcement truck pulled up outside his home. The officer, polite but firm, explained that the city had received multiple complaints about illegal construction, unpermitted wiring, and even hazardous waste. All false. Every single one. The officer took one look around and realized it immediately. But the visit itself was proof that someone was deliberately filing bogus reports. Mark thanked him for his time and handed over a copy of his growing file of evidence. The officer nodded and said quietly, "You're not the first one with HOA trouble around here." That night, Mark couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made him check his cameras. Every flicker of movement made him wonder if Karen or her allies were snooping again. He felt trapped in his own home, a home he'd worked years to afford. The next morning brought a new kind of escalation. A letter from the HOA lawyer arrived, demanding he cease all defamatory public comments about the association or face legal action. The public comments they referred to? A few online posts Mark had made in a local forum, warning others about fake HOA police. They were trying to silence him. But Mark wasn't alone anymore. Word had started to spread, quietly at first. A few neighbors he barely knew began reaching out, sharing their own stories of harassment and false fines. One had been charged for failing to repaint her fence, even though it was brand new. Another had been threatened with foreclosure over a mailbox color dispute. The HOA's pattern was clear. And now, thanks to Karen's obsession, Mark had evidence tying it all together. He decided to go public. Using his camera footage, letters, and documents, he compiled a detailed timeline of everything that had happened, from the first notice to the police encounter. Then, he uploaded it to a neighborhood Facebook group and a local forum. Within hours, it exploded. Dozens of residents commented, many sharing their own experiences. Screenshots circulated, accusations flew, and suddenly the HOA board found itself under community scrutiny. Karen tried to post a defense, insisting everything was taken out of context. But the tide had turned. Later that week, Mark received a call from the same officer who had visited before. The police had officially opened an investigation into the unlicensed security company and its connection to the HOA board. For the first time in weeks, Mark smiled. The truth was finally out. But he also knew this was far from over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. That evening, as the sun set over the quiet street, Mark glanced at his camera feed. Everything looked peaceful, until a shadow moved near the side fence. Someone was there. Watching. And this time, whoever it was wasn't alone.